What's up, everyone? I hope you're all doing well. It's been a while since I dropped a new episode, but I've been totally swamped with work these past few weeks. In any event, I'm super pleased to bring you a new interview and conversation I recently had with Dr. Sean Kelly from the California Institute of Integral Studies. I first came across Sean's work in the late 1990s and early 2000s in the book he co-edited with Donald Rothberger entitled Ken Wilber in Dialogue, Conversations with Leading Transpersonal Thinkers. It's a fantastic book, and it had such a profound impact on me that I eventually pursued a degree in religious studies at Concordia University in Montreal. That said, I can't begin to express how much of an honor it was for me to connect with Sean and learn a bit more about the history that led him to this book project. Some of the other subjects that we touch upon are 1. The relationship of the field of psychology of religion with transpersonal psychology in Ken Wilber's work on an integral approach to philosophy and religious studies. 2. German Idealism and its impact on the field of psychology of religion, transpersonal psychology, and the founding of various consciousness studies programs across the United States in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. 3. The rise of East-West psychology and comparative philosophy of religion in Canada and the United States following the 1960s counterculture revolution. 4. The ongoing impact of Carl Jung and William James on the field of psychology of religion and transpersonal theory. 5. Finally, we also touch upon his other co-edited volume with Sam Mickey and Adam Rodder on the variety of integral ecologies. I hope you all enjoy this episode, and like usual, make sure to check out the references and notes for further readings. Cheers! All right. Well, welcome to the podcast, Sean.
Glad to be here.
Like I was saying, I'm super excited to talk to you. I've been having so much fun kind of connecting with some of your graduate students and now colleagues as well. So this is, I've been looking forward to this ever since we exchanged a few emails. I figured maybe we can go and start because the first acquaintance with your work, essentially, I discovered was through the Ken Wilber in Dialogue book that you wrote with Robert.
Actually, yeah, who's Donald Rothberg? That's right,
Donald Rothberg.
Yeah.
And I guess my first question to you is, how did that project kind of get off the ground?
Yeah, good question. Well, I was actually in Canada when it began. I was teaching at, I had been teaching full-time at University of Windsor for 5 years. That was my first position right after graduating. And, my area of specialization was psychology of religion. And at the time, and still to a certain extent, the leading edge, I thought, theoretically speaking, was with Ken Wilber and Stan Grof. So Jung was my home base, but so I taught a core course in psychology of religion, and I featured Ken Wilber and Stan Grof, and students loved it. Of course, my older colleagues were not so thrilled, but transpersonal psychology, especially then, this is in the late 80s, early and mid 90s, was clearly outside of the pale of what was considered the dominant and acceptable paradigm in religious studies and psychology of religion. So yeah, I was a bit of an outlier. I was holding that torch. I had a few friends in Windsor and in Ottawa who were equally excited as me. But then when I moved back to Ottawa and was teaching as an adjunct faculty at University of Ottawa in Carleton, continuing to teach that course, I was still more or less a voice crying in the wilderness, except for the students who enjoyed it and a few friends. In those years, especially even starting in Windsor, and then in Ottawa, I became increasingly aware of how many people that I was studying were concentrated in the Bay Area and somehow connected with California Institute of Integral Studies or Saybrook or some of the other institutions that have actually gone under in the meantime. And how did I meet? Oh, I know what. Yes, I had met Richard Tarnas when I was in Canada. Actually, I met him in Prague, but we were in touch while I was in Canada. And he had been asked if he wanted to edit a special edition of a revision journal devoted to Ken Wilber's work.
Okay, yeah.
And he wasn't particularly inclined to take up that task, but he asked me if I was interested, and so I was very interested. And somehow, I guess Rick put me in touch with Donald Rothberg as well, and we started communicating, me in Canada, him in Berkeley, I guess. Or no, he wasn't even in Berkeley yet at that time. But we collaborated on what became 2 issues of Revision Journal that formed the core material for what then became Ken Wilber in Dialogue. So for that core material, we added a conclusion as well as Ken Wilber's response to the initial material. And then each of the authors had a chance to respond once again to Ken Wilber's response. That was the dialogue part. So that's how that happened.
So it was the Revision magazine essentially that was the hub essentially that brought you guys all together to put that initial connection. Okay, because I wasn't too sure if it was through the Humanistic Psychology Association or the early beginnings of Transpersonal Psychology Association as well and stuff like that. So I was curious to go through how you got involved in that, particularly as a Canadian. So I mean that's the interesting connection I was trying to kind of figure out, I guess, the history of it as well. But your background, if I understand correctly, you started off in English. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, okay. English literature, and toward the middle of that, as an undergraduate, I had a kind of sudden and lasting conversion experience to Jung.
Okay.
And then toward the end of my undergraduate studies, I decided to switch to a double major in English literature and religious studies.
Okay.
Then I went on to do my master's and Ph.D. in religious studies, carrying through Jung. So for my master's, I ended up doing my thesis on the Gnostic Gospels, which had recently been translated into English. I did a Jungian analysis of the Gnostic Gospels, and then I went on to the PhD to focus on Hegel and Jung. But Jung was the main line, and it was in that, in those early years that I discovered transpersonal psychology and Ken Wilber.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, and if I understand correctly, you spent quite a few years, I think, working for the Jungian Association or Society of Ottawa, if I understand correctly.
That's right. Yeah. So I guess I was in my early 20s, and I was the program director for the Jung Society of Ottawa for a number of years, and got to meet all kinds of Jungian analysts. My mentor through my late undergraduate and my master's degree, and then on my doctoral committee was John Dourley, the late John Dourley. I don't know if you know him, but
I picked up on that in some of your other kind of online conversations, and I had heard of him, but I have never met him or read specifically his work, but I had been familiar, with him in the Ottawa area. So that's very interesting, particularly because of his relationship, where he had some back and forth with Gregory Baum.
Oh, I didn't know that.
At one point or another, through some connections, actually through CIIS as well, but also through Fordham University,
right.
And St. Michael's, St. Michael's up in Toronto. Okay, fascinating. Okay, so basically, your graduate studies and your MA, basically was split between the Jungian Society and Ottawa U, I guess.
Well, the Jungian Society was, just something on the side that I did, but it was a great experience because I got to hang out with people who were interested in Jung and meet all of these visiting Jungian analysts. I actually wanted to become a Jungian analyst at that time, but I couldn't afford a personal analysis. So I never took that route. But, I did, after I left University of Windsor, and there was a 5-year period back in Ottawa where I could only get adjunct teaching. And I was applying for jobs all over the place and not getting them. I did put out my shingle as a Jungian-oriented counselor. I couldn't call myself a psychotherapist because I didn't have formal training.
Okay.
But I did see clients for a few years in Ottawa as a transpersonal therapist / counselor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, that was a good experience. But that clearly wasn't my destiny to be an analyst or a therapist.
No, for sure. Well, I mean, because that's, I guess, kind of my next question as well, is that, I mean, because from the Jung, I guess your background with Jung, and then obviously you fell in love with Hegel. And I'm curious to know a bit more about how that came about as well. But I guess, how did you fall into the whole humanistic psychology and transpersonal psychology realm?
Yeah, I wonder
Particularly
how
on the American front, because in Canada, I guess Jungian psychology has always been quite popular, I guess I could say. But in terms of like humanistic and even transpersonal psychology, because I mean, it's far and few between that you can actually sit down with academics or teachers or professors and actually talk about the field.
Yeah, that's so true.
Um,
I'm trying to remember what the first entryway would have been. I was fairly early on interested in what then was called the new science, or
okay.
sometimes new paradigm studies, featuring typically the work of David Bohm, Rupert Sheldrake, Karl Pribram, and others who were all proposing an alternative to the dominant, mechanistic, reductionistic scientific paradigm. So I was really drawn to that. And I think I may have discovered Wilber's early book called Eye to Eye, I think it is, a collection of his essays, where he has this brilliant essay on the new paradigm. I can't remember what it's called now, but I started reading Ken Wilber, and my education prior to university was almost non-existent. My formal education. I mean, I was kicked out of high school in the beginning of grade 11, and it was really a miracle that I managed to finally get my grade 13 as a separate diploma without completing 10, 11, or 12. And that enabled me to get into university at the right age. So I had a lot of catching up to do. And even by the time I was in graduate school, I was painfully aware of the fact that I'd never be able to read everything I thought that I should have read. But then I discovered Ken Wilber, who seemed to know everything, and have a map, a really coherent, compelling map that, like a skeleton key, much like Jung. Why I was drawn to Jung with this theory of the collective unconscious and the archetypes. It enabled me suddenly to feel like, oh, I can voyage into this vast realm of other cultures, other worldviews, and I don't necessarily need to have read it all. So I think that was my initial attraction to Ken Wilber.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, because I mean, I guess all the people that I've interviewed, and one of the main reasons why I started the podcast is the connection to Ken Wilber. I mean, Michael Brooks was a sort of a public figure and very inspiring figure that kind of drew us all into some sort of orbit, and very excited about how he was, I guess, weaving in politics with integral theory in a certain way and religion. So, I mean, guys like Jeremy and me and some other people, Matt, obviously, Siegel, very excited to go and see that out in the culture. So when we start to connect, I mean, we start to reminisce, or maybe I'm reminiscing in terms of how I came across Ken Wilber, and now discovering, I mean, this whole cohort of people that grew up on his writings, right? And and how that kind of fits in with in terms of your generation. Obviously you're a bit older than I am, but I mean also in terms of Ken's kind of generation as well. And So that to me has been really fascinating. But up in Canada, I mean, I was, especially out in Montreal, I was a bit of a lone wolf. There's been, a few friends and acquaintances, and the internet has allowed me to go out and connect with all kinds of people. But formally, in terms of my education background, particularly in religious studies, I mean, nobody wanted to talk about Ken Wilber.
Yeah, I know, it's so true. Hey, by the way, do you know Francis Charette in Ottawa?
No.
Sorry, not Ottawa, Montreal. Okay. He's semi-retired now, but we were in graduate school together, but he's lived in Montreal, a really bright man. He was head of the consciousness, or maybe founded the consciousness studies program at Goddard, and taught there for many years. Yeah, but he did his dissertation on Jung and spiritualism, and he knows vast amounts of he's like a walking encyclopedia of anything to do with Jung and comparative religion. And
oh, okay. Yeah, because Goddard is another little hub. I mean, I guess, obviously CIIS is kind of out in far away from where I am, or in terms of Montreal. But Goddard, I actually know quite a few people that actually studied up at Goddard in terms of their low residency program, particularly people in actually counseling psychology, actually, that were affiliated with the applied human science department up at Concordia here in Montreal. So that's actually where I found two homes, essentially. I found a home in the applied human science department. There's a lot of people with clinical psychology and counseling psychology background in that department. And then I had another foot in the religious studies department. So I'd be going back and forth between both departments and desperately trying to get people to read Ken Wilber. It really, they were, well, actually, when I brought up Ken Wilber or integral theory, two of the professors that I actually had, they thought I was actually talking about Jacques Maritain.
Huh. Wow.
In terms of his integral humanism. And I was like, no, that's not the same thing at all in terms of background. And
well, it's interesting you bring that up because, as you know, well, 7 years ago, let's say, if you had put in integral ecology, for instance, internet search, it would have been 99% to do with actually my friend and former student, Sean Esbjorn Hargens, which is, the Ken Wilber version of integral ecology. But now, if you do that search, 90% of it is Pope Francis's integral ecology from the encyclical.
Yeah. No, beyond excited about that as well. I mean, that's why I reached out to Sam as well, and I'm so excited to go out and talk to you about how that came about as well. But I guess I have one question in terms of your background with Hegel. I mean, because Canadian idealism, or Charles Taylor and his background in terms of related to Hegel, I was wondering if that actually had an impact on you while you were up in Canada. And is that a bit of a reason why you went the Hegelian route for a while?
Well, I mean, I remember I was happy I met Charles Taylor once. I still have his autographed copy of his Hegel book when he came and gave a talk at the University of Ottawa. But it was actually in my last year as an undergraduate, or maybe it was in the master's degree at Carleton, in a course by John Dourley.
Okay.
He used to teach a course on Teilhard de Chardin, Paul Tillich. Maybe it was just Teilhard and Tillich. And Jung. Teilhard, Tillich, and Jung. It was those three. And in one of his typical lectures, where the board was full, giving his genealogy of the evolution of Western thought from usually Plato and Aristotle, going through Augustine, Aquinas, to the modern times, he said a few things about Hegel and Jung, and he just threw out a few words about a remarkable deep resonance between Hegel and Jung, with their view of the evolution of consciousness as being, the gradual differentiation and unfolding of a kind of, he didn't use the word transpersonal, but transpersonal spirit. And I just noted that, and I started looking into Hegel. I didn't know that much about him, and I quickly saw, oh my God, there really is something deep going on here between Hegel and Jung. and I did a search for what there was at the time on Hegel and Jung, and there was really almost nothing. There was just one article in German. There were a few scattered references in Jung's works, and that was it. And I thought, wow, this is remarkable because there's so much here. So John Dourley was the one who planted that seed in my psyche, and it quickly blossomed into a major preoccupation that became my dissertation.
Gotcha. So, and he assisted you, or he was your supervisor for your MA and your PhD, or he was just somebody
for my MA, and then he's the external committee member for my PhD.
Okay.
So by then I had gone to University of Ottawa, and he was still at Carleton.
Yeah.
So he was brought in as the external for the Jung part. For my Hegel part, I had Theodore Jaretz from the philosophy department, who not too long ago passed away, major Hegel scholar, with H.S. Harris, another Canadian. They collaborated on all kinds of things, but I guess more recently a new English translation of Hegel's Encyclopedia Logic. So he was my Hegel mentor, Theodore Jaretz.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. Because the Canadian idealism, I guess if we can go and call it that, or Hegel's impact on Canada or Canadian thinkers it's an area of research now that's percolating more and more. I guess it's difficult for me to go out and figure out if it's, Charles Taylor had such a huge impact on the culture, but there's, antecedents and other figures as well, particularly German idealism or British idealism, that, that's had a deep impact on Canadian psyche and culture. So I guess because with your background in English lit too, because I remember reading that you were really into Coleridge and Blake. So was there any, I guess, inklings or interest in British idealism before you actually discovered Hegel, or is it purely just discovering Hegel on, kind of offshoot?
It's a good question. And in fact, I have no direct experience with the British neo-Hegelians. I know of McTaggart and Bradley and Bosanquet and so on, and I've dipped into them, but I was never drawn to them.
Okay.
And they've had no influence on me. So no, it was definitely and initially with Coleridge, at that point I was really more interested in Schelling because of the connection, the more obvious connection with Jung, since Schelling was the first person to coin the word unconscious, das Unbewusst, and Coleridge actually was the first to use the word the unconscious in English. So that was my initial, I guess, indirect connection with the German idealists through Coleridge to Schelling.
Okay.
But then when I discovered Hegel, I found, to me, an even more robust and generative dialogue partner with Jung than Schelling. There's a lot there in Schelling, but it goes much deeper, I think, with Hegel.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Okay. So in terms of the book, I guess the Ken Wilburn dialogue book, once that went out and started up that particular project, is that when you end up, how you landed up at CIIS, or how did that transition actually happen for you in terms of, from Ottawa to California is quite the jump too.
Yeah, they were sort of happening at the same time, but I was in my period in the desert, as it were, those 5 years in Ottawa after my full-time appointment in Windsor, wondering whether or not I'd ever land a full-time position. I couldn't get anything in Canada. I came that close to getting the only position in the psychology of religion in Canada, in Toronto, and it was down to me and my former best friend. And I made the mistake of giving my talk on Groff and mentioning psychedelics, I think, whereas my friend gave his on Freud, and he got the job. But anyway, and I'm sure he deserved it, and he's an amazing scholar. But I was crushed at the time, and at a certain point, it was 90, I think it was 92, I heard that the International Transpersonal Association was having its meeting in Prague. And
Oh,
Stan Groff, whom I guess I had met once by then, and he was a president of the ITA, and I looked at the lineup of speakers, and everybody who was anybody in the transpersonal and new paradigm world was going to be there in Prague, including
wow. Okay.
David Bohm. And I had already met David Bohm, a couple of times, and we had corresponded, but I'd met him at Birkbeck College in London, and so I just maxed out my credit card and went to Prague for this conference.
Yeah, yeah.
And oh yeah, that's right. I had discovered Richard Tarnas's recently published book, The Passion of the Western Mind.
Oh, yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I was just blown away by it. I mean, I remember picking it up just, by chance, as it were. And I immediately went to the index and checked if there's any references to Hegel. Oh, good, Hegel. I bet you there's no Jung. I checked, wow, Jung. And I said, just for a lark, I'm going to look for Groff. And Groff was there too. So it was Hegel, Jung, and Groff in the index. So I bought the book, read it cover to cover, and it just, I'd never read a more brilliant or beautifully written book before. So I heard that Richard Tarnas was going to be at this conference as well.
Okay.
So I went to Prague. I attended Rick's lecture, talked to him after, and we only had a 5-minute conversation, but we just understood each other immediately.
Yeah.
I went back to Canada, and about a year later, somehow he had tracked me down. He wrote me a letter. This is before really email or anything like that, and asked if I'd be interested in writing a review of The Passion of the Western Mind for the San Francisco Jung Institute Library Journal. And
Oh my God. Okay.
of course, I was thrilled, and I wrote that. And in the meantime, he had just started this program at CIS. He had been invited to teach at CIS, and we founded the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program. So, I made a trip to San Francisco to the old school. I met Rick there. And then I went back to Canada. And then the next year he called me, and the program was doing well, but he wanted to get to work on his next book, Cosmos and Psyche. And he knew he'd never do it if he was directing the program. So he invited me to come and teach. And, but it was just for one quarter, not even a semester, it was one quarter.
Yeah.
And I had to decide. I left my homeland, my relationship, my home, everything that I knew for this uncertain gig teaching one semester at CIS. And
oh my God.
As soon as I got here, I knew that this was my home. And that was 25 years ago.
Unbelievable. It's amazing. Yeah, because I love this history in the background of it and the connections that, that everybody's had, particularly through the humanistic and transpersonal psychology movement. Like your book is an amazing tome of articles, and the people in that book are amazing as well. I mean, they've all had a massive impact on me, not only reading that, but as figures, in terms of whether it be in the meditation community, the Buddhist community, and stuff like that, and humanistic and transpersonal psychology. So you landed there at the beginning of the founding of the program. I didn't realize that. So you were basically and Brian Swim was there as well. So he was
there. Yeah. Brian Swim, and Charlene Spretnak, Dave Delancey. Ralph Metzner wasn't in our program, but he had been in discussions for the founding of the program. He was still at CIS. Stan Groff was in our program teaching with Rick. It was surreal, because suddenly everything that had been sort of in the implicate order or the ether of my spiritual intellectual world suddenly became the figure, and that's where I was. So like a figure ground gestalt switch. So in Ottawa, it was all sort of internal and a couple of friends.
Yeah.
And then suddenly this was my environment, and it was bizarre.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing story. And now, how you guys have passed on into your graduate students now, and the work that they're doing now as well, and the impact that they're having out in the culture is amazing to me to go out and watch and witness, because there is this new generation moving on now, like Sam and
And
Matt's work, I mean, it's unbelievable work. They're
yeah,
so inspiring, and I mean, they're still so young.
I know, they're amazing. They really are. Our program is so lucky that they came on board, and now with Stan retired, Rick semi-retired, Robert McDermott retired, Brian semi-retired. So yeah, I came in as the young kid on the block, and now I'm the elder.
Yeah.
Which is strange, but I feel so grateful that there's Matt and Jake, and now our newest faculty member, Jack Bagby, who just arrived. We're expecting good things from him, and Elizabeth Allison. Yeah, so it's
Excellent. No, I mean, I'm so happy to go out and see that sort of intergenerational sort of torch being passed on as well there. And this new generation is exciting to go out and watch. But I guess now, reflecting back on the humanistic transpersonal psychology and how it eventually became sort of integral theory, because I mean, there was some pretty interesting back and forth and riffs and clicky type stuff as along the way. Well, even before your time, because I remember reading in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology how Wilbur had a bit of a riff with Rollo May and Paul Tillich.
Huh. I wasn't aware of that.
In terms of, I mean, it was Albert Ellis, Rollo May, and with Paul Tillich as well. Well, Paul Tillich was, I guess, Rollo May's teacher specifically, but there's a few articles in there that I mean, it really had an impact on me, and to go and realize that why there was this rift between humanistic psychology and transpersonal psychology, or existential humanistic psychology, and how there was a bit of a split there, which would eventually became known as transpersonal psychology. So I guess now, even you reflecting back on that history now, I mean, how do you see it now? Do you think transpersonal psychology was a necessary development, I guess, within psychology and philosophy, or how do you view that right now personally for yourself, looking back on that history?
Well, on the one hand, I see Western psychology as being transpersonal in its origins, at least, with Gustav Theodor Fechner and William James.
Yeah.
So the German and the American beginnings of psychology were both transpersonal, and then Jung, of course. So these three figures were. Jung even called the collective unconscious at one point the transpersonal unconscious. So I feel it was there in the beginning, but then got eclipsed by how Maslow, famously described it as the first and second forces of behaviorism and psychoanalysis. So then, of course, we have the 60s, or the countercultural movement in general, which brought in the humanistic movement and the human potential movement more broadly, but also the opening to both non-ordinary states of consciousness, primarily catalyzed by LSD and but other substances as well, and the opening to the East, with the lifting of the Asian Exclusion Act. So there are much more free flow of teachers and people from East, particularly to the West Coast. So all of that countercultural environment was the matrix out of which, and toward the end of which, the formal founding of transpersonal psychology occurred, like in around 1970 with Grof and Maslow and Sutich. Grof seems to be the one who gave it the name, and then the journal was founded at that time. So I see the transpersonal psychology movement as the formalization in thought, which occurred at the sunset of the counterculture, much in the same way that German idealism, and particularly with Hegel's synthesis, but Schelling as well, how that occurred at the sunset of that other major, mini axial age, we could call it, that coincided, with the end of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and then the Romantic movement. So as that came to a close, you have this, in a sense, formalization in the thought realm of that mutation of consciousness, which gave us German idealism. So I see transpersonal psychology, from a theoretical point of view, at least, as being a resonant, in a kind of resonant phenomenon with what we saw with German idealism in that former period. So
yeah, I see that. I see that quite clearly as well there
do
too.
you?
Well, and the other thing too is, I mean, it's just the amazing place that CIIS is, right? I mean, it's
Mm,
the original school of East Asian studies as well. So, I mean, that confluence of East-West psychology is so strong there,
mm,
and is so present in Wilber's work as well. So, I mean, I guess that's another dimension there that, and I guess it's East-West philosophy or comparative philosophy as well that you guys have been doing and pioneering out there for decades now.
yeah,
I
it's
mean,
so true.
in
Yeah.
terms of how that came about and stuff like that. Because I do tend to get, I guess, kind of lost, I guess, in terms of how transpersonal psychology or even humanistic psychology has been overshadowed, I guess, at times by positive psychology and cognitive science now.
Mm-hmm.
And I just get so frustrated with that. I just feel like, like there is a whole slew of intellectuals and scholars that I feel that just don't get the props, I guess, in
Yeah,
positive psychology and cognitive sci these days. And I think that's such a shame.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, it's
you know,
true. Yeah, yeah, it seems, yeah, theoretically, it seems so often so thin, and with many attempts to uh, arrive at formulations which, you know, were already formulated
yeah,
previously, often in more complex and generative ways. But
no, for sure. Yeah, no. And and I guess that the human potential movement as well, right? Is that there's the good, the bad, and the ugly of the human potential movement in a certain way that I feel academics, and particularly, they're very dismissive, and that's something I experienced personally in religious studies.
mm,
That studying religion in North America, if you were interested in East Asian studies or Buddhism in North America, it was just like frowned upon. It was like, well, no, we don't study it in North America, and
huh,
yet that's to me was what it was so interesting. It was this confluence of and transmission of cultures, that happen
mm,
all across North America. I mean, whether it be German idealism from, from the West, and now Buddhism and Hinduism and thinkers like Sri Aurobindo and stuff like that. I mean, they just had such a tremendous impact. Yet, I find, yeah, academic philosophy can be pretty snobby when it comes to viewing some of these subjects, and I always a bit frustrated with that. That's actually one of the reasons why I decided not to go out and pursue graduate studies and in religious studies, particularly. I just felt myself butting heads with people about that type of clash there.
it's unfortunate. I didn't know things were still. Yeah, I've lost touch with the religious studies community in communities in Canada.
Yeah,
So I'm not really sure what's going on, but yeah,
no,
is it?
for sure.
Huh?
And did you keep a correspondence as well with John Dourley as well over the years since once you left Canada, or did you keep in touch with some people here in terms of?
Yeah, well, yeah, John and I would have periodic contact,
Okay,
not as much as I would have liked, but I was glad that I saw him last time I was in Ottawa, about 4 years ago, and short, not that long before he died, fairly suddenly. So yeah, but not as much as I would like. I mean, I still have occasional contact with some of my old, well, most of my mentors are no longer with us, unfortunately.
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I still have occasional contact with some of them.
And
But
family up in Canada as well. Do you have any family left here, or?
I have a brother and sister who are still alive, and they're both in Gatineau.
Oh,
Yeah.
no way. Okay.
Yeah. And I have many, many, many cousins on my mother's side that I'm not really in touch with, but
Okay.
yeah, a lot of Degagnes and in the Ottawa area, probably quite a few Kellys and McGuires, but but when you're here for 25 years, it's easy to lose touch with the homeland.
No, for sure. Yeah. And I read as well that essentially you grew up Catholic, though, if I understand correctly, right?
Yeah, a very benign Catholicism, in the sense that my parents were not especially devout. And when my father died when I was 7, but up until that point, we would all go to mass on Sundays together. After he died, my mother, I think, stopped going, but I kept on going, and I was an altar boy, until probably my first LSD experience at 13, and then
Okay.
that opened up a whole other realm where I, not only because of that, but with puberty, as often happens, I no longer felt the need to go to church, but the experience of the Mass, and although I never studied the Bible, having a family Bible at home, which was an illustrated Bible, actually, wonderful plates. And I'd spend most of my time with the plates. I wouldn't read it, but I would. But going to mass, of course, I'd hear the liturgy, and it was in Latin at first, and then it was in French, and seeing the images, not only of the cross, but of Mary, but just the central rite of the Eucharist, I think, had a deep, deep impression on my psyche at an archetypal level. So, yeah, and Mary. So I don't consider myself a Catholic, but I'm a small C Catholic, I guess, and
Yeah.
I'm equally, Buddhist and Taoist as I am, and Indigenous as I am Catholic now.
Okay. Beautiful. Yeah, no, it's same here. Kind of growing up in Quebec. Well, my parents, after the Quiet Revolution, they were so happy that that whole period was over. So luckily, I was spared that horrible education growing up. And, we had, I grew up with Alan Watts around the house,
Wow.
and then eventually Ken Wilber started to appear around the house. So my dad my dad had actually had a background in counseling psychology, and my dad actually studied a bit at Goddard as well.
Huh.
He spent, because he worked for the YMCA up in Montreal that eventually became Concordia University, and they had done quite a bit of. They would send either people to Goddard, or they would send people to other universities and stuff like that to go and do ongoing continuing education. So he did that while he was there for the YMCA, and so.
Wow.
Yeah, and he got exposed to American culture quite a bit. So I'm super thankful for that, because I got exposed to the 1960 counterculture, the beatnik stuff as well, and so I'm so happy that they came to infuse our culture in Quebec,
Yeah.
and stuff like that. But in terms of but it's purely English or Irish Catholic, if I understand, was your background mostly in terms of the family, right? Or is there some French mix there?
Father was Irish Catholic, mother was French Catholic.
Okay.
And I went to a French school from grade 1 to grade 8.
Okay.
I was an altar boy in a French Catholic church, Saint Geneviève. And I'm grateful that I had no traumatic experience with the Catholic Church, or I know many have, but mine, that's why I say it was quite benign, and I'm grateful for it, actually.
No, for sure. And the I guess since your mother was partly French, is that why you ended up going to study with Morin in French a bit?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I not been so I went to French school up to grade 8, even though I almost never spoke French. My spoke English with my friends and English at home, and I had a major complex being one of the only francophones in a French school. All my friends were like, Pierre Laflamme and Julie,
Yeah.
Julie those whatever, and I was Sean Kelly. Sean, Sean. There was Sean Kelly and Jack Corkery. We were the only two non-French name people.
Yeah.
So I had a major complex growing up speaking French, but it gave me at least a foundation for speaking it and reading it.
Yeah.
And then in my doctoral studies, we had only one required seminar, and the chair of the department at the time, Roger Lapointe, I did the seminar with him, and he had been in correspondence with Edgar Morin, and he had us read Morin's first two volumes of La Méthode, of Method, the only two that had appeared at that point. La nature de la nature and la vie de la vie, the nature of nature and the life of life. And when I read these, I thought, oh my God, this is so Hegelian, I was working on my dissertation on Jung and Hegel, so everything is Hegelian. But Morin really is strongly influenced by Hegel. And so I wrote Morin in Paris, and I applied for the France-Canada Graduate Scholarship to do a postdoc with Morin, but it took me longer to do a year longer than I had expected to do my dissertation. I got the scholarship though, so I took a year leave of absence from the doctoral studies and went to Paris for a year to study with Morin, and that was so transformative for me. I mean, he became, along with Jung and Hegel, the three most important intellectual, sort of spiritual mentors.
And he's a towering figure in French culture as well. I mean, not only philosophically and from a system science perspective on things, but also politically as well. I mean, he was very involved on the left post 68. With a lot of people around that time there too as well. And I guess that was the other thing too, that kind of like when I start to see that in terms of your own personal history and stuff like that, I was wondering if his politics had an impact on you.
Yeah, well, he's certainly, I mean, my natural tendency is I'm way to the left. I mean, I'm pretty, I guess I don't like labels, but I tend towards communism in a classical, particularly in more enlightened readings of Marx,
which is something we don't talk about a lot in integral circles, I find.
No,
which I think is interesting as well. Because some of the circles that like with Jeremy and Matt, that's and particularly with Michael Brooks, that came up a lot because Michael Brooks veered very much to the left around Occupy, and he's always been a self-identified Marxist. And the interesting thing that he was doing out in the culture is weaving integral theory in with sort of left-wing politics. And there's a generational sort of thing going on now as well within the sort of integral movement now, where people feel that the integral movement has been sort of a very sort of neoliberal sort of vehicle possibly integral theory just sort of adopted a neoliberal sort of business sort of motif to go out and spread throughout the culture. And some people have had that kind of critique. So I was curious to, like now that when I saw that you went out and studied in France and you studied with Morin, I was curious to see how much of an impact his thinking from a political level had an impact on you. So it has. That's really interesting.
And not so much not so much to lean me or strengthen my leaning to the left, since I was already there. But what Morin has helped me try to cultivate, is a more complex attitude and a more complex to try to come to a more complex understanding and analysis of the political situation, and to be wary of even, the easy not polarization, easy dichotomy between right and left. I mean, I personally, I have no qualms about identifying the right and condemning it and resisting it. But I also recognize that the simple distinction between right and left often is not enough. One needs to be more specific. So Morin helped me in that way with his mastery of complexity and the need to think in a complex way in order to be adequate to the complexity of our planetary moment.
Yeah. Oh no, definitely. Yeah. And I mean, that's the interesting thing too about CIS in terms of, Thomas Berry and his impact, I guess, on some of the thinkers there as well, that there is this sort of Catholic underpinning, which is a very the progressive wing, left wing of Catholicism in a certain way that has been present very much on that side of the culture in a certain way. And I guess that's the other thing too that obviously I'm super excited to talk to you about is obviously the work that you've done now in terms of integral ecology and the weird overlap that's now had with Pope Francis's work and encyclical. Like I had such a fun time talking to Sam about that, and in terms of his Catholic background as well, and how never really self-identifying as a Catholic, and then all of a sudden, doing this work, and then all of a sudden having, Pope Francis move into the mix, and throw in this new twist in the culture around the integral movement.
That is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I've been blown away. So at this point as well. So I mean, you met when obviously you moved into the graduate program up at CIS. This is where when Sean came into the program as well.
That's right. He was my first doctoral student.
Okay.
I mean, my first doctor to graduate. He came probably when I had been there for about 3 years, maybe in my third or fourth year there. Sean came as a student.
Okay. Amazing. And now there's you guys from this work that you guys been ongoing and the dialogues that you guys been having around the idea of integral ecology along with humanistic and transpersonal psychology has turned into a whole new program as well in terms of, well, there's an integral ecology track, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, there is. I mean, it's not a formal, we do have a certificate that people can get in integral ecology. But in terms of the master's and PhD, people can declare that they want to be in this track. And for that, they just need to satisfy more specific course requirements. And they end up doing, if it's in the doctoral studies, they would end up doing their dissertation in that track. And that's what Sam Mickey did. He was one of the early adopters of this integral ecology track in our program, and ended up writing his dissertation on the verge of an integral ecology. What is on the verge of? What was it called now? On the verge of a planetary civilization.
Planetary civilization, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that is.
That's right. And where he brought his own, unique gifts and genius to this realm of integral ecology. So before the Pope's encyclical, I had already I had already formed the desire and commitment to try to help cultivate a more diverse engagement with the idea of integral ecology.
Okay.
Which is why I started referring to it in the plural, integral ecologies, because at first, if it meant anything to anybody, they would immediately think of Ken Wilber, which is fine. But I was aware that, well, for one, Thomas Berry is the one who seems to first use the term integral ecology. But then Leonardo Boff, liberation theologian, had been using it. He probably got the term from Thomas Berry, but he had his own vision of integral ecology, which was strongly influenced by Thomas Berry. And as it turns out, not only Brian Swim, but Edgar Morin. I mean, I wrote Leonardo Boff and asked him, who were your main influences? And he said, Thomas Berry, Brian Swim, and Edgar Morin.
No way. Wow.
And Leonardo Boff was drafted by Pope Francis as his main guy for the chapter on integral ecology for the encyclical.
That's amazing. That's so unbelievable. Wow.
So when the encyclical came out, I said, oh, wow, wonderful. At least there's one other, competitor, and more than a challenger. I think, he's clearly, in terms of web presence, the Pope's version has eclipsed the Wilberian version for now. But I'm hoping, and this was our hope in putting out this volume, The Variety of Integral Ecologies, that there would be a more diverse field of inquiry, because, for instance, Joanna Macy is I consider to have birthed a remarkable, compelling vision of what I would call an integral ecology that has both a theoretical and a practical experiential dimension. There are all kinds of integral ecologies out there. So yeah,
well, just the field itself. I mean, I think if Sam has gone out and really pioneered that as well, along with some other folks, the relationship between religion and ecology now is a huge, or the environmental movement is a fascinating new lens, I guess, to go and study religion as well. Which is a total flowering of different thinkers and way of looking at the world. But yeah, you're right. I mean, Joanna Macy is amazing figure when it comes to environmental stewardship and the work that she's done.
And
so she's had a major impact on you as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, she's a dear friend, and she lives just a couple of miles away here in Berkeley. We co-taught together in our program for about a decade, the course on the Great Turning, and then she retired, and I teach that course on my own. But she has become one of my main figures in the communion of saints that inspire me. That sort of began with Coleridge and Hegel and Jung, Sri Aurobindo, Teilhard, Tillich, Graf, Edgar Morin, and Joanna Macy. They're sort of my. I'm glad I have one woman in there. There are many women that inspire me, but in terms of those who have deeply influenced my own thinking and teaching, Joanna is really at the center now.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. No, I mean, the whole sort of Buddhist psychology and the whole Buddhism in North America is a fascinating story and history in itself, in terms of how it's transformed the culture. And it's had a tremendous impact, I think, on a lot of Protestants as well. Interestingly, I find a lot of my Protestant friends or evangelical sort of people that had bad Christian sort of religious upbringings and stuff like that. They'll flock to Buddhism or to the East, and it's a great way for them to go out and seek some sort of solace and sometimes healing and sometimes ongoing education as well. So I'm so happy and that's even something that I did. I mean, I studied up at the Montreal Zen Center with Albert Lowe for almost a decade while I was completing my degree in religious studies as well. And he's, in the line of Philip Kapleau. So, and if that wasn't there, there was a big vacuum in my life, sort of, in terms of the decaying church in Quebec, since it's just it wasn't very alive. I mean, there was a few movement afters in terms of Thomas Father Keating and through the integral movement, through contemplative and centering prayer type stuff that and Thomas Merton eventually came around and poked me again and said, come back around and look at your own roots as well. But I mean, don't. I mean, there's such a rich tapestry of religions now all across North America. I'm so happy for that.
Yeah, and the indigenous, I don't know whether indigenous spiritualities and worldviews are getting more attention in Canada. I mean, I know that
Oh yeah.
there's better representation in Parliament, at least, than in the United States. But
Yeah.
I don't
Well,
know.
it's been a source of tension, but I mean, it's also been a big, a sense of renewal as well for Indigenous peoples. I think that there's been an infusion of hope in some leaders there that this is something that we should go out and cherish, and it's something we should go out and maintain in terms of our historical heritage and stuff like that. And John Rawson Saul is done a great job, I think, weaving in, moving away from the two solitudes to some sort of three solitudes in terms of the founding of what Canada is and stuff like that. And that's a story that I cherish quite a bit there. Yeah. So, but in terms of the integral ecology track now, I mean, because now you've written that book. I mean, Sam is doing quite a bit of work over at the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology.
Yeah, religion and ecology. Yeah.
So I guess where do you see that kind of going now? I mean, in terms of that, this. I mean, these moments have happened now with different influences within that kind of track.
Yeah. Well, my sense is that the planetary polycrisis, as Morin might call it, is accelerating and intensifying as we speak. That it's just becoming more and more obvious to our students that there's a crisis of the future. I mean, there's really, it's almost impossible to imagine even 5 years from now the world being better than it is. It's it feels increasingly inevitable that we're heading into more and more challenging times with climate chaos, with climate refugees, probable civilizational collapse. I mean, we're seeing signs of civilizational collapse in many places around the world, and even in this country, there are pockets where we could say that we're witnessing civilizational collapse. But once I think the inevitable intensification of destructive climate chaos and interruptions of supply chains and the food supply, the global food supply, let alone whether or not some sort of generalized war breaks out somewhere, we're in for really rough times. So this has got to be the focus for any responsible graduate study, any shaping of scholars and activist scholars, which is what we hope to help create in this program, is engaged scholars in one form or another, who will take the seriousness of our planetary moment to heart and direct their life path accordingly. So the integral ecologies track was really an initial attempt to create a space in an academic program where one could focus one's attention on these matters, particularly encouraging looking at the intersections of ecology, politics, social justice, and spirituality, religion, spirituality, this ethics, let's say. Speaking of the variety of integral ecologies, I mean, I consider even, this other Canadian hero of mine, Naomi Klein, not Naomi. Yes.
Yeah, Naomi Klein, yeah.
Yeah, with This Changes Everything, and especially capitalism versus the climate. So this is, to me, this was a noble example of a movement in the direction of an integral ecology. So where she says that, okay, yes, if we're going to try to respond effectively, creatively to climate chaos, I would say, people say climate change. Yes, we need to get carbon emissions under control, but to do that, we will need to change everything, particularly the political economy. But then she recognizes as well that to change a political economy, we also need to change fundamental worldviews and ethical configurations and so on. So we have the environment, right? Ecology with climate change as a kind of strategic leverage point on the one hand, but then necessary intersection with the political economy and ethics / worldview spirituality. So to me, this is, if we weren't in this mess, my temperament would be just more in the direction of metaphysics and poetry and literature and music. That's where what I'm sort of cut out for. But yeah. I've not forced myself, but felt compelled over the years to turn my attention more and more to the accelerating planetary crisis. And so my most recent book, Becoming Gaia on the Threshold of Planetary Initiation, is where I, gives a sense of where I'm trying to do whatever I can from within the realm of theory, and integral ecology. But we need people to be doing whatever they are temperamentally suited and karmically called to do, whether it's theoretical or on the ground, whether it's really, really local, or whether it's more broadly political. We need it all, because as bad as things are and are going to get, there is so much that we still can do to minimize the suffering and to create conditions for some kind of renewal on the other side, not knowing what will be possible, but if anything is to be possible, then it will only be possible if we do what we can now and over the next few years. So that's what I'm trying to focus my attention on, and the integral ecology track was my first shot in that direction.
Well, the coincidence of it overlapping with Pope Francis's work is, to me, because even I guess when Sean wrote his book with Zimmerman the first time around in terms of integral ecology, I felt called to it to a certain extent, obviously concerned with the environment and stuff like that. But once I saw your tome come out and the timing with it, with everything else, I just thought it was so fascinating, because there seems to be something in the culture also, not just, in terms of the environmental movement, but there seems to be a diversification within the integral movement itself. It seems to be much more granular. It seems to have taken root, in parts of Europe that I never thought, this would happen. The conferences for a while were happening out on the West Coast for a while, where you guys were, and then now all of a sudden it seems to have moved to some parts of Europe.
Yeah, Eastern Europe, Russia, Eastern Europe especially.
And there's weird kind of quasi think tanks that are popping up around integral theory and applying integral philosophy and versions of integral education as well, which I find fascinating too. Now that that the integral movement, if you want to call it that, what happened in the early 90s into early 2000s hasn't disappeared. It's still there. It's still very much present within the culture, doing its thing, and it pops up every once in a while. And I'm fascinating with the history of how that's undergoing and developing, and how it's being transmitted as well onto new generations and stuff like that. So and I'm so forever grateful. I'm so grateful for teachers like you that have been doing this for over 20 years now, in terms of passing on the baton and doing the graduate work with students, and forging new colleagues now that are going on to different universities.
Yeah, but you've been keeping the flame burning in Canada, which is great,
Yeah.
It must have had its challenges.
Yeah, no, I mean, luckily there's been, a few, well, Layman Pascal is actually up in Canada.
Oh, that's right, in Thunder Bay, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So we're kind of the lone wolves up in Canada doing our thing.
Mhm.
And there's been pockets of stuff going on out in British Columbia as well.
Mm.
There was a few zine magazines that popped up around integral theory and humanistic and transpersonal psychology throughout these periods as well. Kind of along the revision journal, not as impactful, I guess, as the revision journal that you guys founded and did work through, but I'm excited about that history as well, how it's going to go out and take form within our consciousness as well. There's been some great tombs now or books that have been written on Esalen,
Mm.
the history of Esalen, and I feel that almost like there needs to be a good history book on CIIS at one point or another, and all the work that you guys have been doing since the early '80s, all the way up to the present there.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah,
it would make a fun story.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Huh.
Well, rock on. Listen, I don't want to go out and keep you much longer either. I know you've been very generous with your time. This has been a real honor for me to go out and connect with you and for you to go out and share this history as well.
Well, it's been a delight, Eric. I'm
Yeah,
so glad that we were finally able to connect live, and it warms my heart to think of you up in Montreal doing what you're doing, and that there's the connections are still alive.
definitely. Yes, and to be continued. That's like how I usually like to end it as well. And
Great.
hopefully we'll have another conversation somewhere down the run as
I,
well.
I look forward to that.
Super. Well, thank you. Have a great night.